Daughter of the Otherworld kicks off Era 2 of Shauna Lawless's Gael Song series. Tune in for a full, no-spoiler review.
This is Fantology.
You may have heard of us.
So if you're new to the series and didn't read the first trilogy, I recommend that you do that. I'll get more into that in a second when I define Era 1 versus Era 2. But overall, what is this? So I describe this series as a hauntingly beautiful historical fantasy. Hauntingly beautiful because of the language and imagery that it invokes. It invokes this 12th century Ireland perfectly in a way that is both beautiful but also has this like aura of mystique and mystery to it, and just kind of this whole vibe that I think is really fun to read through. And then historical fantasy, meaning this is real on Earth 12th century Irish history, which is fun for me because I was not familiar with this time period, but it pretty quickly became apparent after reading the book how important this time period was. It's a time period of change and a time period that over the next millennia or so really kind of shaped Irish history, and current Ireland has a lot of roots in what happened here in this century. Fantasy elements are there as well, but not incredibly strong. It's more of like the point of view characters know about the magic, they know about the magical groups in the area, but the mortals have most of the power, and it's mostly our few magical characters interacting with the mortals and kind of staying behind the scenes and keeping their magical abilities secret. Now, there's also a fair amount of romance. That's a big flavor of the series, but it's not romantasy. There's no real spicy romance. It's kind of like fade to black, but that definitely has those romantic vibes, and the romance love story is going to be a central theme of this book and the remainder of the series. Daughter of the Otherworld and the rest of the Gael Song books are all about 350 to 400 pages, so enough of a story to sink your teeth into and really get absorbed into, but not a big fantasy doorstopper. So this being Era 2, we have about a 150-year time gap from the events of the first trilogy, which took place in 10th century Ireland. That story is pretty much a wrap, except for some characters who still appear over 150-ish years later in 12th century Ireland. How, you may ask? Well, there is magic in the world, and some of these characters are very long-lived, and they're going to pop up again. Some characters here in the second trilogy that we're now getting point of views from were younger characters in the first trilogy we didn't get nearly as much from, so that's fun. We're getting a fresh perspective, but we do see some old friendly faces pop up here again in the second trilogy, so there's a good amount of carry-through. Now, that said, if you don't remember all that happened in the first trilogy, that's fine. I did not do much of a refresh and just kind of jumped into the book, and I found that it sprinkled enough details in to remind me of the important things, and I never really felt like I was lost because I couldn't remember who exactly was descended from who, etc., etc. Like, it does a good job of telling you what's important, and the stuff that's not, it just kind of skips over. And if you want that, you can go back and read the first trilogy. And if you haven't read the first trilogy, I definitely recommend that you do before getting into Daughter of the Otherworld. You would enjoy it just fine, but you're going to miss out on a lot of details. There's a lot of, I don't want to say Easter eggs, but there's a lot of carryovers between the two, and some of the important plot points are just not going to hit as hard if you don't know exactly who these characters were back 150 years ago. Now, you can read the first book and then get excited about it and go back and read the trilogy, and I think that's perfectly fine. You may have a different reading experience, but I think optimally you probably want to read from beginning to end, and the story began several years ago. Now, if you like the first trilogy and you're wondering what you can expect from the beginning of the second trilogy, I think it'll be to your liking. It has a pretty similar formula as we follow a small group of magic users as they interact with the mortals that are doing the important real Earth historical events, and we kind of learn about that, but also mostly get acquainted through the eyes of these people who are not mortal, and that lends to some interesting themes and ideas and viewpoints that are explored. The setting is still this perfect evocation of medieval Ireland, although years have passed and now more international affairs are starting to pop up around the world, and that's no exception here, as, like I said, this is a very important time for the next millennia of Irish history. And then, of course, we still have the romantic elements, although like a lot of things in this first book, it's mostly setup, and setup that, well, maybe a little slow in this first book. I think it has a very high potential to pay off in some interesting ways. Give us a lot of interesting drama and big, action pieces, I imagine, will be happening. Although I am preventing myself from Googling about real 12th century Ireland history because there's going to be a lot of spoilers. I mean, I think I can kind of get the vibe of where we're going here because I do know like a little bit about history. But overall, like as far as who lives and dies and what happens with people, I think if you would Google it and read through, like you're going to find that information out. That was the case with the first trilogy. So probably don't do that. After finishing the book, the thing that I'm most excited about was a thing that I think that Shauna Lawless improved on the most is it ends with a really nice twist that I did not see coming. Looking back, I think I should have because the clues were there, and probably many astute readers will pick up on this, but I didn't, for better or for worse, and I still really enjoyed it, and I thought the twist was fantastic, and I think it sets up for a lot of drama going forward. So I think Shauna did a really good job with that. I don't recall this happening really to this level in the first trilogy, so bravo on that improvement there. Okay, breaking down some of these elements a little bit more. Characters, so we have 4 main POV characters, and they're mostly in different locations throughout the book, so it's a lot of jumping around and kind of balancing the pacing and events of the book to make sure that everyone's progressing at the same rate, which I think is done pretty well. There are some new characters, some old, some we know very well from the first trilogy, and some that were just introduced like right towards the latter end of the third book and are now very much at the forefront of book 4. I enjoyed all these point of view characters. However, there are a lot of secondary characters and they kind of come in and out a bit, and I had trouble tracking them at times. And so I think that I feel like that was a bit of a weakness. Some characters are just kind of like introduced, and they're like the archetype of, this is a serving woman, this is a knight type of thing, and they don't get fleshed out too much. But I guess, we weren't really trying to, and with 350 pages, we're not really, not a big mess there, but I think there's a lot of kind of interchangeable names and faces. Now, I really liked the main character, and to say who this character was is probably a little bit of a spoiler if you've only read the first trilogy, but you'll be pleased with the identity of this character. I thought that she was very strong. Her characterization was great, and she was always a joy to read. Other than some secondary characters being interchangeable, the only other nitpick I have was a character who is very important, this main character. I felt like he was developed kind of slowly, and I didn't realize his importance until all of a sudden there was like a switch flipped a little bit. It's like, oh, okay, like this is the guy, and he's super important and he's interesting in these ways. Like I felt like the introduction to this character was just kind of a little slow, and then all of a sudden, as I get it, it all makes sense now, but I didn't latch on to him maybe quite as much as I should have, or maybe as much as like Shauna would have wanted me to as a reader of the book. Now, the setting is just perfect, and you can tell that Shauna is very much Irish and also loves Irish history with the ease and brilliance at which she creates the setting and just transports you there. I feel like I'm, walking along the grass and I'm living in these hard times back in the 12th century AD. It's rough living back then. People were not living very long. They were going to war and they were just dying. And even if they weren't, it was very rough life, except for the few kind of favored nobility, and even then, things were not great. They were being killed and blinded right and left, and it was just so much chaos, and the events of the plot fit in perfectly with this, because sometimes you, in a story, in a book, you think like, oh, these characters, they should all be smart, and they should be considering out all their actions and plotting out how they're going to achieve their goals over time. But a lot of this is just chaos as one king after another is like, oh man, I gotta go and march my army over here today, because otherwise this is gonna fall apart. And they didn't all have Peter Baelish and Tyrion Lannister advising them like they do in a series like A Song of Ice and Fire, which is a totally different vibe, where it seems like everyone is so nefarious and sneaky. And here it's just kind of like, we're going with the flow and we have to, and we're not really able to stop and think this through too much, but we're just going to throw our chips out and we'll see where they land. And that seems like really authentic history. The book started kind of slow. That was the weakest part for me. There's a lot of setup and getting characters established, getting the point of view characters established, kind of moving them from where they were at the end of the first trilogy to where they needed to be years later at the beginning of Daughter of the Otherworld. I didn't love that. I feel like maybe there could have been another inciting event or something here to kind of move things along. The first like 60 to 80 pages or so are a little slow, not like unbearable to read or anything, but you kind of wish like, okay, let's get things going a bit. And then we do get this inciting event that I wished for. I think maybe in my preference it would have just been a few pages earlier. But this happens. It's the first of 3 main events that the story is centered around. I thought the ending was by far the strongest part of the book. The last 60 or so pages, to contrast from the slower start, are all very fast paced and things are happening. Twists are happening, action stuff is happening, romance is happening. It all kind of comes together at this ending, and I thought that was fantastically done. And really the most exciting thing for me is it sets up very well for what I think could be great drama, great action. Now, that romance that I mentioned does happen a little fast. I would have been okay with a little more build-up, but that's how it goes, and I guess we're fine with that because that is pretty similar to how the romance in the first Gael Song trilogy happened. And I guess if we're being realistic about this, back in the day, these people were not living too long, so there's no point in having the slow burn. If there's a romance, if there's a spark between people, you gotta seize love, as is one of the themes of the series. So if you enjoyed the first Gael Song trilogy, I think you're very much going to enjoy Daughter of the Otherworld, and I think you'll be looking forward to the rest of the series, as am I. Overall, I'm going to give this book a 7.5 out of 10, knocking it down a little bit because of a slower start, but increasing it back because of a banger of an ending. I anticipate giving the next 2 books higher ratings because they are not going to have slow starts. I can't really see of any reason why, because at this point, all of the pieces are on the board and we're just like going forward with the action and the drama and the heartbreak and the romance. Like all of this stuff, I think has a lot of room to impress me, and it did in the first trilogy. So I'm looking forward to the rest of the series.